I didn't expect her to stay this long, Jenna muttered, her hands buried in soapy dishwater. I glanced up from the newspaper, watching her scrub a plate with more force than necessary. It's been 2 months, not a lifetime, I replied, keeping my tone light. Jenna sighed, dropping the plate onto the drying rack with a clatter. It's not that I don't love her, Ryan. She's my mom, after all. But don't you feel like she's always around? I didn't respond right away, my mind flicking back to earlier that morning. Her mom, Diane, had been out in the garden, trimming roses in the soft light of dawn. She wore an old sundress that swayed as she moved, her hair loosely pinned back. It was hard not to notice how radiant she looked, even with streaks of dirt on her hands. Ryan, Jenna's voice snapped me out of my thoughts. You're not even listening. Sorry, I said quickly, folding the newspaper. You were saying? Jenna rolled her eyes. Forget it. Diane moved in after her divorce, an abrupt, messy split that left her with no other place to go. Jenna had welcomed her with open arms, insisting it was only temporary. But weeks turned into months, and Diane had quietly settled into our home. To her credit, Diane wasn't a burden. She cooked meals, kept the house spotless, and even helped with little repairs I'd been putting off for months. It was hard to find fault in her presence. If anything, she was the perfect house guest. But the more time we spent together, the harder it became to ignore the subtle tension. The way her laugh lingered when I told a joke. The fleeting touch of her hand on my arm as she passed me in the kitchen. The stolen glances when Jenna wasn't looking. It happened one evening, after Jenna had gone to bed. Diane and I were sitting on the back porch, the air heavy with the scent of blooming jasmine. She poured us each a glass of wine, her eyes sparkling in the moonlight. You've been so kind, Ryan, she said, her voice soft. Letting me stay here, helping me get back on my feet. I don't know how to thank you. You don't have to thank me, I replied, trying to keep my tone casual. She smiled then, a warm, genuine smile that made my chest tighten. You're a good man, she said, her hand brushing lightly against mine. It was an innocent touch, but it lingered a moment too long. My pulse quickened, and I quickly pulled my hand away, standing up. I should, check on Jenna, I stammered, heading back inside without looking back. After that night, something changed. Diane's presence felt heavier, her gaze lingering a little too long, her smiles carrying a subtle hint of something unspoken. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild. But every time she leaned a little closer or laughed a little too warmly, it became harder to ignore. Jenna, oblivious to the undercurrents, continued as if everything was normal. But for me, nothing felt normal anymore. One afternoon, I came home early from work to find Diane in the kitchen, kneading dough for what I assumed was Jenna's favorite homemade bread. Her sundress was dusted with flour, her hair tied back in a loose bun. You're home early, she said, glancing up with a smile. Yeah, boss let us out early, I replied, leaning against the doorway. She wiped her hands on a towel, her smile softening. Can I pour you some iced tea? I nodded, watching as she moved gracefully around the kitchen. There was something hypnotic about her, something I couldn't quite put into words. As she handed me the glass, her fingers brushed against mine, sending a jolt through me. Her eyes met mine then, and for a moment, the world seemed to pause. Diane, I began, my voice barely above a whisper. She stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. Ryan, The sound of the front door slamming broke the spell. Jenna's voice echoed through the house, cheerful and unsuspecting. Hey, I'm home. Diane stepped back quickly, her cheeks flushed. I'll finish dinner, she said, her voice tight. I nodded, my chest tight as I turned to greet Jenna, the weight of what had almost happened pressing down on me. That night, as Jenna slept peacefully beside me, I lay awake, my thoughts a whirlwind of guilt and confusion. I knew I needed to put distance between Diane and myself to keep things from spiraling out of control. But deep down, I wasn't sure I wanted to. The morning after that fleeting moment in the kitchen, Diane acted as if nothing had happened. She greeted me with her usual warmth, offering coffee and asking about my day. But beneath her casual demeanor, I could feel a shift. Her glances lingered a little longer. Her laughter seemed softer, almost intimate. and every time she brushed past me, the air grew heavier with unspoken words. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, but the tension was undeniable. And the worst part? I didn't want it to stop. A week later, Jenna asked if I could take Diane to the hardware store. She needs some stuff for the garden, Jenna said, pulling on her shoes. I'd take her myself, but I'm swamped at work today. Of course, I said, too quickly. Diane appeared a moment later, her sun hat in hand and a light cardigan draped over her shoulders. Ready? She asked, her smile as effortless as ever. The drive to the store was filled with polite conversation. Weather, garden plans, nothing too personal. But as we walked through the aisles, choosing fertilizers and plant stakes, the mood began to shift. Thank you for doing this, she said as we loaded the bags into the car. It's no problem, I replied, brushing the dirt off my hands. She hesitated, her gaze meeting mine. You've been so kind to me, Ryan. I hope you know how much I appreciate it. Her words were innocent enough, but the way she said them, soft, almost tender, made my heart race. On the way home, dark clouds rolled in, and within minutes, the rain began to pour. It came down in sheets, the windshield wipers struggling to keep up. We should pull over, Diane said, her voice tense. I nodded, steering the car onto the shoulder. The rain thundered against the roof, turning the world outside into a blur. Looks like we're stuck for a bit, I said, leaning back in my seat. Diane laughed softly, her fingers tracing patterns on the fogged-up window. I used to love storms like this, she said. They always made the world feel smaller, more intimate. I glanced at her, my chest tightening. Yeah, I murmured. I guess they do. The silence between us stretched, heavy with possibilities. I could feel the pull, the unspoken connection drawing us closer. Ryan, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. But before she could say more, the rain began to ease, the pounding on the roof softening to a gentle patter. I started the car, forcing a smile. Looks like we can get going. She nodded, her expression unreadable. Back at the house, Diane disappeared into the garden, and I retreated to the garage, hoping the physical labor would clear my head. But no matter how hard I worked, I couldn't shake the image of her in the car, the way her voice had wavered, the way her eyes had searched mine. That evening, over dinner, the tension was palpable. Jenna chatted away, oblivious to the undercurrents between Diane and me. Mom, you should take a break tomorrow, Jenna said, gesturing with her fork. You've been working nonstop in the garden. I don't mind, Diane replied, her gaze flickering to me for the briefest moment. It keeps me busy. Jenna smiled, completely unaware. Well, Ryan can help you if you need it. He's been spending so much time in the garage. I'm sure he could use a change of scenery. Diane laughed lightly, her eyes meeting mine. Maybe I'll take you up on that. The next day, Jenna left early for work, leaving the house eerily quiet. I found Diane in the garden, kneeling in the dirt as she pruned a row of roses. Need a hand? I asked, stepping onto the grass. She glanced up, shading her eyes from the sun. If you're offering, I joined her, the two of us working side by side in silence. The air was thick with the scent of freshly turned soil and blooming flowers. At one point, our hands brushed as we reached for the same tool, and the shock of the contact sent a jolt through me. She didn't pull away, her fingers lingering against mine. Ryan, she said softly, her voice trembling. I looked up, my heart pounding as her gaze met mine. The vulnerability in her eyes was undeniable, a mirror of my own. She began, but the words caught in her throat. Before I could think, before I could stop myself, I leaned in, my lips brushing against hers in a tentative, fleeting kiss. She froze for a moment, and I pulled back, my chest tightening with panic. Diane. But before I could finish, she closed the distance between us, her hands cupping my face as she kissed me back, her movements hesitant but full of longing. When we finally pulled apart, the reality of what had just happened crashed down on us. Diane's cheeks were flushed, her breathing unsteady as she stepped back. This can't happen, she said, her voice shaking. I know, I replied, my own voice barely above a whisper. But even as the words left my mouth, I couldn't ignore the way my heart ached at the thought of letting her go. The days following that moment in the garden were a blur. Diane avoided being alone with me, retreating to her room or burying herself in household tasks. I tried to keep my distance too, but the memory of her lips on mine haunted me, pulling me back into the weight of what we'd done. Jenna, oblivious to the turmoil brewing beneath the surface, carried on as usual. She even suggested a family dinner to bring everyone closer. The irony was almost unbearable. The evening of the dinner, Diane was quiet, her eyes fixed on her plate. Jenna didn't seem to notice, chatting animatedly about her latest work project. "Ryan, pass the salt," Jenna said, pulling me out of my thoughts. I reached for the shaker, my hand brushing against Diane's as she reached for it at the same time. The contact was brief, but the jolt it sent through me was unmistakable. Diane pulled her hand back quickly, her cheeks flushing as she focused on her food. "You okay, Mom?" Jenna asked, glancing at her with concern. "Fine," Diane replied, her voice tight. "Just a little tired." Jenna nodded, turning her attention back to her story. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Diane's fatigue had nothing to do with lack of sleep. That night, unable to sleep, I stepped out onto the back porch for some fresh air. The cool night breeze brushed against my skin, and the distant sound of crickets filled the silence. I wasn't expecting to see Diane sitting on the porch swing, her arms wrapped around herself as she stared out at the darkened garden. "Couldn't sleep either?" I asked, keeping my voice low. She glanced up, her expression a mix of surprise and something else, something I couldn't quite place. "No," she admitted, her voice barely audible. I hesitated, then took a seat on the swing beside her. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching between us like a chasm. "I've been trying to make sense of everything," she said finally, her voice trembling. "But I can't." "Neither can I admitted. She turned to face me, her eyes glistening in the moonlight. "What we did, it was a mistake." "I know," I said, though the words felt hollow. "But it doesn't change how I feel." Her breath hitched, and she looked away, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "Ryan, this can't happen." "Jenna." "I know," I interrupted, my voice firm. "But I can't ignore this, Diane. I can't pretend it didn't happen." She didn't respond, her silence speaking louder than any words could. The following afternoon, Jenna announced she'd be working late. "Don't wait up," she said with a grin, grabbing her bag as she headed out the door. Diane and I exchanged a brief glance, the weight of her absence settling heavily over the house. By the time the sun began to set, Diane was in the kitchen preparing dinner. I stood in the doorway, watching her move with a quiet efficiency that had always drawn me in. "Do you need help?" I asked, stepping inside. She glanced at me, her expression wary. "I've got it under control." "Are you sure?" I pressed, moving closer. She sighed, setting down the knife she'd been using. "Ryan, we need to talk." I nodded, my chest tightening. "I know." She turned to face me, her gaze steady but pained. "This has to stop. It's not fair to Jenna. It's not fair to any of us." "I know," I said again, though my heart rebelled against the words. For a moment, we just stood there, the air between us thick with everything we weren't saying. And then, before I could stop myself, I reached for her, my hand brushing against her cheek. "Ryan," she began, but her voice faltered as I leaned in. This time, the kiss wasn't tentative or fleeting. It was desperate, filled with all the longing and confusion that had been building between us. She pulled away first, her breathing unsteady. "We can't do this," she whispered, her voice breaking. But even as she said it, she didn't step back. Later that evening, as we sat in the living room watching TV, Jenna's voice echoed through the house. "I'm home." I tensed, the weight of guilt crashing down on me as Diane quickly busied herself with folding a blanket. Jenna appeared in the doorway, her smile bright as she set down her bag. "How was your day?" she asked, oblivious to the undercurrents in the room. "Good," Diane said quickly, her voice too bright. Jenna didn't seem to notice, flopping onto the couch beside me with a contented sigh. But as the evening wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that our secret was starting to unravel. A week later, Diane disappeared for the afternoon without explanation. When she returned, Her face was pale, her expression guarded. "Is everything okay?" I asked, catching her alone in the hallway. She hesitated, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the counter. "Ryan, I need to tell you something." My stomach dropped. "What is it?" She met my gaze, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and something else, something that made my heart stop. "I'm pregnant," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air, the weight of them crashing down on me like a tidal wave. I stared at Diane, her words ringing in my ears. "You're pregnant?" She nodded slowly, her hands trembling as she twisted them together. "I didn't plan for this, Ryan. I didn't expect this." My mind raced, trying to process the weight of her confession. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in as I grappled with the enormity of what she'd just told me. "Does Jenna know?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Of course not," Diane replied quickly. "I haven't told anyone." She stopped, her breath hitching. "I don't even know what to do." Neither did I. That evening, the tension in the house was unbearable. Jenna, oblivious to what had transpired, chatted happily about her day while Diane and I exchanged tense glances across the table. "You two are so quiet tonight," Jenna said, her brow furrowing. "Is everything okay?" "Just tired," Diane said quickly, forcing a smile. "It's been a long day." Jenna nodded, seemingly satisfied with the answer, but her gaze lingered on me for a moment longer. "What about you, Ryan?" I forced a chuckle, hoping it sounded convincing. "Same here. Work's been hectic." But as the evening wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that Jenna was starting to sense that something was off. The following morning, Diane pulled me aside in the hallway, her expression taut with worry. "We need to figure this out," she said, her voice low. "I can't keep pretending everything is normal." "I know," I replied, running a hand through my hair. "But we need to be careful. If Jenna finds out, she'll hate us," Diane finished, her voice trembling. I reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "We'll figure it out together." Her eyes met mine, a flicker of relief crossing her face. "Thank you." That evening, as Jenna was getting ready for bed, I found Diane in the kitchen, washing dishes. She looked up as I entered, her expression wary. "I've been thinking," I began, keeping my voice low. "Maybe we should tell Jenna. She deserves to know the truth." Diane's face paled. "No, we can't. It'll destroy her. It's going to come out eventually," I argued. "We can't hide this forever." Before Diane could respond, Jenna's voice carried down the hallway. "What are you two whispering about?" I turned quickly, my heart pounding as Jenna appeared in the doorway, her gaze flickering between us. "Just talking about the garden," Diane said smoothly, her smile too bright. Jenna raised an eyebrow, but didn't press further. "Well, don't stay up too late," she said, retreating back to her room. As soon as she was out of earshot, Diane turned to me, her eyes wide with panic. "We can't slip up again, Ryan. We can't." A few days later, Jenna came home early from work. I was in the garage, pretending to tinker with tools, when I heard her voice, sharp and accusing, coming from the kitchen. "What's going on, Mom?" Jenna demanded. "You've been acting so strange lately." Diane's voice was muffled, but I could hear the tremor in it. "Nothing's going on, Jenna. You're imagining things." "Don't lie to me," Jenna shot back. "I'm not stupid. I know something's wrong." I froze, my heart pounding as I strained to hear their conversation. "I can't do this right now," Diane said finally, her voice breaking. "I need some air." Moments later, the back door slammed shut, and I heard Jenna's footsteps heading toward the garage. Jenna appeared in the doorway, her arms crossed. "What's going on, Ryan?" "What do you mean?" I asked, forcing a casual tone. "Don't play dumb," she snapped. "Mom's been acting weird for weeks, and now you're avoiding me too." "What's going on?" I hesitated, my mind racing for an explanation. "She's been under a lot of stress," I said finally. "The divorce, moving in here, it's a lot to handle." Jenna narrowed her eyes. "And what about you? You've been acting just as weird." "I've been busy with work," I lied. "That's all?" She didn't look convinced, but she didn't press further. "Fine. But if I find out you're lying to me," she let the threat hang in the air before walking away. That night, Diane knocked on my bedroom door after Jenna had gone to bed. She looked exhausted, her shoulders slumped, and her eyes rimmed with red. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice trembling. "It's tearing me apart." I pulled her inside, closing the door behind her. "We'll figure it out," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I'm going to tell her, Ryan. I can't keep lying to my own daughter." My chest tightened. "Diane, if you tell her, she deserves to know the truth," Diane interrupted, her voice firm despite the tears. "Even if it destroys everything." I stared at her, my mind spinning. The thought of Jenna finding out was unbearable, but deep down, I knew Diane was right. The next morning, Diane was uncharacteristically quiet, her movements slow and deliberate as she prepared breakfast. Jenna sat at the table, scrolling through her phone, occasionally glancing up at her mother with suspicion. I sat across from Jenna, the weight of Diane's confession hanging heavy between us. I could feel the tension building, each moment stretching painfully as I waited for Diane to make her move. Finally, she set down the spatula and turned to face us, her hands trembling. "Jenna, I need to talk to you," Diane said, her voice unsteady. Jenna looked up, her brow furrowing. "What's going on?" Diane hesitated, her gaze flickering to me for support. I gave her a small nod, even though my chest felt like it was being crushed. I haven't been completely honest with you," Diane began, her voice shaking. "And there's something you need to know." Jenna set her phone down, her expression growing serious. "What are you talking about, Mom?" Diane took a deep breath, her hands gripping the edge of the counter for support. "I'm pregnant," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The silence that followed was deafening. Jenna's eyes widened, and she looked between Diane and me, confusion and disbelief etched across her face. "What?" Jenna said, her voice sharp. "How? How is that even possible?" Diane's face crumpled, and tears streamed down her cheeks. "I didn't mean for this to happen, Jenna. I never wanted to hurt you." Jenna's gaze snapped to me, her eyes blazing with anger. "You knew about this?" I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. "Wait," Jenna said suddenly, her voice dropping. Is it his?" Her accusation hung in the air like a grenade, ready to explode. "Jenna, please," Diane began, stepping toward her daughter. "Answer me." Jenna screamed, her voice breaking. "Is it his?" The room seemed to tilt, the weight of her question pressing down on me. I glanced at Diane, who looked utterly shattered. "Yes," Diane said finally, her voice trembling. "It's Ryan's." The words hit Jenna like a physical blow, and she staggered back, her face pale. I can't believe this," she whispered, shaking her head. "Jenna, I'm so sorry," I said, my voice desperate. "It wasn't supposed to happen. We didn't mean—" "Stop!" Jenna shouted, cutting me off. "Don't you dare try to justify this. You betrayed me. Both of you." Jenna stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her. The sound echoed through the empty kitchen, leaving Diane and me standing in stunned silence. "She'll never forgive us," Diane whispered, her voice breaking. I reached for her hand, but she pulled away, her eyes filled with tears. "I don't even know if I can forgive myself," she said, her voice trembling. I didn't know what to say. The damage was done, and no amount of words could undo it. The days that followed were unbearable. Jenna refused to come home, staying with a friend while she tried to process everything. Diane barely left her room, and when she did, she avoided me entirely. The house felt cold and empty, a shell of the home it had once been. One evening, Jenna returned to gather her things. She didn't say a word to either of us, her expression icy as she packed her belongings. "Jenna, please," Diane said, her voice pleading. "Can we just talk?" "There's nothing left to say," Jenna replied, her tone flat. I stood in the doorway, my chest tightening as I watched her leave without so much as a backward glance. Weeks turned into months, and the silence in the house grew deafening. Diane and I tried to navigate the fallout, but the weight of our actions hung between us like a wall we couldn't break through. One evening, as we sat in the living room, Diane turned to me, her expression somber. "I've been thinking," she said quietly. "About what?" I asked. "About leaving," she said, her voice trembling. "This isn't fair to Jenna. She deserves a chance to heal. And as long as I'm here, that won't happen." The thought of her leaving sent a wave of panic through me, but I knew she was right. The day Diane left, the house felt impossibly empty. She hugged me tightly at the door, her tears soaking into my shirt. "I'll always love you," she whispered. "But this isn't the life we wanted." "I know," I said, my voice breaking. As I watched her drive away, I couldn't help but wonder if we could ever find redemption, or if the choices we'd made would haunt us forever. Months later, I received a letter from Diane. She'd moved to a small town upstate and was focusing on her pregnancy. She didn't say much about Jenna, but the pain in her words was clear. I folded the letter and set it aside, the weight of everything we'd lost settling heavily on my chest. Sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes the choices we make have consequences we can't escape.